September 19th, 1944. 11:23 hours. Near Arracourt, France. Private First Class Walter Joseph Kowalski, 23 years old, from Detroit, Michigan, crouched inside the cramped turret of M4 Sherman Tank 3, Charlie 7, watching to the periscope as 3 German Panzer IV tanks emerged from a tree line 800 yards distant. His hands were shaking, not from fear alone, though fear was certainly present, but from the knowledge that the loader who had occupied this exact position 48 hours earlier was now dead, killed when a Panzer round punched through their turret during the engagement at Arracourt. Walter was a replacement, a mechanic by training. He had loaded exactly 4 training rounds during his entire combat preparation at the replacement depot before being assigned to this crew 3 days ago. The gunner beside him, Corporal Thomas Henderson, 24 years old, from Ohio, was screaming something about traverse speed, his hands working the elevation and azimuth wheels with practiced precision. The tank commander, Sergeant Raymond Miller, 26 years old, from Pennsylvania, stood in the turret hatch above them, yelling coordinates. Panzer, 11 o'clock, 800 yards. Load AP. Traverse left 10 degrees. The driver, Private James Rodriguez, 22 years old, from Texas, was reversing the Sherman into a hedgerow, attempting to use the natural terrain for hull-down positioning, and Walter was supposed to load the 75mm shell into the breech. Fast. The M4 Sherman's main armament, the 75mm M3 gun, fired a 75 by 350mm round weighing 38 pounds fully assembled. The ammunition consisted of a brass cartridge case containing the propellant charge, with the projectile itself crimped into the case mouth. Standard loading procedure, as taught at every armored force school in the United States, required the loader to extract the round from the ready rack, 20 rounds stored in the turret basket, face the breech, directly grip the shell with both hands, right hand forward near the projectile, left hand supporting the brass case line of the shell with the breech opening, ram the shell forward until the breech mechanism caught step clear of the recoil path. The entire sequence took 4 seconds if executed properly by an experienced loader, 5 seconds if you were nervous, 6 seconds if the tank was moving over rough ground. Walter had watched the previous loader, Sergeant Eddie Morrison, perform this motion dozens of times during their 3-day journey to the front. Morrison had been good, smooth, efficient. He could load in 3.8 seconds consistently. Then a Panzer round had found their turret at Arracourt, and Morrison had died before he could load his 5th shell of that engagement. Now, Walter grabbed the first shell from the ready rack. 38 pounds of high-explosive anti-tank ammunition. His hands were slick with sweat and gun oil. The brass case was cold despite the September heat. The proper method was drilled into every loader at Fort Knox. Grip the shell nose forward, line up the brass base with a breech, slam it home, step clear. Walter turned to face the breech head-on, just as he'd been taught, and immediately discovered a problem no instructor at Fort Knox had ever mentioned. Walter was left-handed. In the cramped interior of a Sherman turret, 7 feet across at its widest point, that mattered more than anyone had considered. When Walter turned to face the breech properly, his left elbow smashed into Henderson's shoulder. The gunner shoved him hard without looking, focused entirely on acquiring the target through his gun sight. The shell nearly slipped from Walter's grip. The brass case was slick. His hands were shaking. The Sherman was still reversing, the entire turret vibrating from the engine and transmission. Sergeant Miller's voice cut to the noise. "Load the goddamn gun, Kowalski!" The Panzers were at 600 yards now. Walter could see them through the vision slits, gray shapes moving across the open field, their long 75mm KWK-40 guns traversing toward American positions. Walter did something that no training manual suggested, no instructor had taught, no regulation permitted. He turned his back to the breech, reached behind himself with his left hand, his dominant hand, and felt for the opening like a blind man searching for a door handle in the dark. His fingers found the rim of the breech, hot metal, still warm from the last engagement. He guided the shell nose backward into the chamber, feeling the breech mechanism's cam surfaces with his fingertips. When the shell aligned properly, he shoved hard with his left arm, not pushing forward with extended arms, but driving backward with his shoulder and back muscles behind the motion. The breech mechanism caught. The block slammed shut automatically. The ready light illuminated. Henderson fired without warning. The 75mm gun recoiled 18 inches. The blast wave, expanding gases from the propellant charge burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, rolled backward through the turret. It singed Walter's neck. He smelled burned fabric and skin. But the shell was loaded. 3 seconds from ready rack to breech closure. Walter was already reaching for the next shell. Same motion. Back turned. Left hand guiding. Right hand gripping the brass case for support. Left arm ramming the shell home with his body weight behind it. 2.8 seconds. The gun fired again. Third shell. The Panzers were returning fire now. Walter heard the distinctive crack boom of an 88mm round passing overhead. Wrong caliber. Must be a Panther somewhere beyond the tree line. 2.5 seconds. Fourth shell. The gunner's voice. Hit. Target destroyed. Traverse right. Second target. 500 yards. 2.3 seconds. Fifth shell. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the cordite smoke and noise. Cease fire. All targets neutralized. The engagement had lasted 4 minutes. They had fired 9 rounds. 4 Panzers destroyed. 0 American casualties. The crew went silent. The only sound was the idling engine and the ringing in everyone's ears from the gun blasts. Walter stood there, back still turned to the breech, hands black with powder residue and gun oil. His neck burned where propellant gases had seared his skin. His left arm trembled from the exertion. 9 shells in 4 minutes, each weighing 38 pounds, each loaded using muscles never trained for the specific motion. Henderson turned in his seat and stared at Walter. His expression was somewhere between confusion and awe. Sergeant Miller climbed down from the commander's hatch and looked at Walter like he'd grown a second head. Nobody loaded a 75mm cannon backward. It violated every safety protocol, every training procedure, every manual written since the M4 Sherman entered service in 1942. But it worked, and in that moment, standing in a smoke-filled turret near Arracourt, France, with his back still turned to a gun that had killed him at the breech failed, Walter Kowalski realized something the instructors at Fort Knox had never considered. What happened next would change how every Sherman crew in 3rd Army loaded their guns. Before we continue how this backwards loading method spread through the 3rd Army and why the physics made it faster than standard procedure, if you're fascinated by these stories of tactical innovations born from desperation that changed military doctrine despite violating every regulation, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the forgotten innovations that save lives. Now, back to September 1944, and the technique that would revolutionize tank gunnery for the next 30 years. The M4 Sherman tank that Walter Kowalski served in was not designed to fight German Panzers head-to-head in open combat. The design specifications, finalized in 1941 by the Ordnance Department's Armored Fighting Vehicle Section, prioritized different characteristics entirely. The Sherman was designed to support infantry operations, break through defensive positions, be mechanically reliable across varied terrain, be simple to produce in quantity, be easy to maintain with standard automotive tools. The United States produced 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks between February 1942 and July 1945 across 11 different manufacturers. They were good tanks for their intended purpose. But by September 1944, their intended purpose had changed. The problem was the gun. The Sherman 75mm M3 cannon could penetrate 3 inches of armor plate at 500 yards when firing M61 armor-piercing ammunition. That penetration was sufficient to destroy Panzer III tanks, frontal armor, 50mm, Panzer IV early models, frontal armor, 50mm, most Italian and Japanese armor. It was not sufficient to penetrate Panzer IV OS, H frontal armor, 80mm at 10 degree slope, Panther frontal armor, 100mm at 55 degree slope, Tiger Eye frontal armor, 100mm vertical. German tank designers understood this disparity. By late 1943, every Panzer rolling off production lines at factories in Friedrichshafen, Kassel, and elsewhere had frontal armor specifically designed to defeat the Sherman's 75mm gun at combat ranges. The Sherman's supposed advantage was mobility and numbers. American armor doctrine, as taught at the Armored Force School at Fort Knox and codified in Field Manual 17-33, stated that 5 Sherman tanks operating in coordinated maneuver could overwhelm 1 German Panzer through flanking fire and speed. The mathematics worked perfectly in theory. In practice, it meant that 4 out of 5 Sherman crews died attempting to get into position for flanking shots. Tank crews called it the death ratio. Statistical analysis from the European Theater of Operations showed that for every German tank destroyed in France during summer and fall 1944, Allied forces lost an average of 3.6 Sherman tanks. Walter Kowalski was one of approximately 3,000 left-handed loaders serving in armored units of the U.S. Army in Europe during 1944. Nobody tracked that number officially. Nobody thought it mattered. At Fort Knox, instructors taught one loading method. Face the breech. Grip the shell with both hands. Ram forward. If you were left-handed, you learned to adapt, to lead with your weaker right hand, to suppress your natural instincts, to do it the Army way. In a stationary tank on a practice range, that adaptation worked adequately. In combat, it was killing people. The interior of an M4 Sherman turret measured 7 feet across at its widest point, tapering to approximately 5 feet near the gun mounting. The loader station occupied the right side of the gun. The gunner sat on the left. The commander stood behind and above them both, his head and shoulders extending through the turret hatch. When the gun fired, it recoiled 18 inches backward in 0.03 seconds, traveling at approximately 50 feet per second before the recoil mechanism absorbed energy. When the turret traversed to track a moving target, everything inside shifted. The floor, technically called the turret basket, rotated with the turret while the hull remained stationary. Space was tight. Every movement mattered. A right-handed loader could extract a shell from the ready rack, pivot smoothly toward the breech, and load without significant interference. His right arm naturally aligned with the breech opening. His left hand supported the shell's weight from beneath. The motion was fluid, economical, safe. A left-handed loader faced the opposite problem. To use the standard method, he had to grip the shell with his weaker right hand leading while his stronger left hand could only support from behind. When he pivoted toward the breech, his left elbow, his dominant arm, swung wide in an arc that inevitably struck. The gunner shouldered the traverse wheel, mounting the radio, set the gun shield interior. Every collision cost time. Sometimes it cost a shell. Dropped ammunition in a combat situation required 10 to 15 seconds to recover, reload, and fire. The result, left-handed loaders averaged 5.2 seconds per round instead of 4.0 seconds. In training, instructors called this acceptable variance. In combat, those extra 1.2 seconds per round translated directly to casualties. The 4th Armored Division arrived at Arracourt on September 18, 1944, as part of 3rd Army's advance toward the Siegfried Line. The division had been in continuous combat since August 1st, advancing through Normandy, liberating various French towns, and maintaining pressure on retreating German forces. On September 18th, German forces counterattacked with elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade, a newly formed unit equipped with 43 Panther tanks and supporting infantry. The Germans intended to recapture Lunéville and threaten 3rd Army's eastern flank. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, which included the 37th Tank Battalion, held positions around Arracourt to block this advance. During the initial engagement on September 18th, the 37th Tank Battalion lost 6 Sherman tanks in 40 minutes. Most were hit before they could fire more than 2 rounds. After-action reports noted that several loaders were killed while struggling with the breech mechanism under fire. One tank commander, whose name was redacted in the casualty reports, stated that his left-handed loader had fumbled a shell during combat, dropping it in the turret basket. The delay cost 8 seconds. A Panther round struck their turret before they could fire their 3rd shot. The loader died instantly. The gunner lost both legs below the knee from fragmentation. The driver and bow gunner survived, but suffered severe burns when the engine compartment caught fire. This pattern repeated across multiple engagements. Left-handed loaders, and even some right-handed loaders struggling with the cramped conditions and combat stress, were experiencing catastrophic loading delays under fire. The problem went deeper than just dominant hand preference. Even experienced right-handed loaders struggled when the Sherman was moving. The M4 had no gun stabilization system. When the tank rolled over rough terrain, which described most of France in 1944, the entire turret shook. The breech moved. Loaders had to time their movements to match the gun's motion. Most loaders solved this by gripping the breech rim with one hand to steady themselves while loading with the other. That technique worked, but it meant controlling a 38-pound shell one-handed while standing in a vibrating, moving platform while someone was shooting at you. One-handed loading was slow, dangerous. Shells slipped frequently. When a loader dropped a shell in combat, it typically rolled into the turret basket, requiring the loader to crouch down, retrieve it, inspect it for damage to the fuse, and reload. 15 seconds minimum. By then, the Panzer had already fired. Tank commanders watched their loader struggle. They watched good men die because loading took too long. Some commanders tried to compensate by calling out fire commands earlier, giving loaders more warning time. Some tried to position their tanks to maximize the time before German tanks could return fire, but there was no official solution. Technical Manual 9-731A stated that loaders would face the breech and ram shells forward. That was the approved method. Changing it required authorization from Ordnance Department, Armored Force School, and ultimately the War Department. Nobody had that kind of time. What the manual writers hadn't realized was that the solution had been there all along. It just required breaking every rule they had written. Walter Kowalski discovered his backwards loading method not through innovation or experimentation, but through injury and desperation. On September 17, 1944, 2 days before the engagement that would make his technique famous, Walter Sherman was struck during a skirmish near Arracourt-la-Petite, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of Arracourt. A Panzer IV round struck their front glacis plate at shallow angle and deflected upward without penetrating. The Sherman's frontal armor, sloped at 56 degrees and consisting of 51 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel, performed exactly as designed. The shell deflected, but the impact transferred tremendous kinetic energy into the hull. The Sherman's crew compartment measured approximately 6.5 feet from floor to ceiling. When the impact occurred, Walter was standing at his loader station, reaching for a shell from the sponson and ammunition rack. The shock wave threw him sideways into the turret wall. He impacted shoulder first at an estimated 15 to 20 miles per hour, the approximate speed differential created by the sudden deceleration of his body, while the tank absorbed the impact. Walter's right shoulder dislocated. The head of the humerus separated completely from the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The battalion medical officer, Captain Robertson, 32 years old from California, reduced the dislocation in the field. The procedure took approximately 3 minutes and was extraordinarily painful. Chun injected Walter with morphine, told him he was done, finished, that a loader with a damaged right arm was useless, and that he would be evacuated to a field hospital for recovery before reassignment to non-combat duties. Standard medical procedure. Sensible. By the book. But Combat Command A was operating at 67% strength. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost 9 tanks in the previous week, destroyed, damaged beyond field repair, or undergoing maintenance. They had lost 14 crew members killed, 23 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Replacement crews were arriving at approximately 40% of the rate that casualties were occurring. Sergeant Raymond Miller, Walter's tank commander, made a decision that violated medical recommendations and probably several regulations. He told Walter to stay. They would figure something out. The next morning, September 18th, Miller's tank engaged German positions east of Arracourt. 3 Panzer IVs appeared through morning fog at approximately 900 yards. Miller ordered Henderson to engage. Walter reached for the first shell with his left hand. His right arm hung nearly useless at his side, functional enough to grip and support, but lacking the strength to lift 38 pounds or execute the standard two-handed ramming motion. Walter attempted the standard method, faced a breech, tried to lift the shell with both hands. His right shoulder erupted in pain that cut through the morphine still in his system. The shell tilted, started to slip from his weakened grip. Henderson was yelling at him to hurry. The Panzers were closing. 800 yards. 700. Walter made a decision born from panic and necessity. He turned his back to the breech, reached behind himself with his left hand, his only fully functional hand, and fell for the breech opening like someone reaching behind themselves to zipper a dress or fasten a difficult clasp. His fingers touched the hot metal rim of the breech. The surface was still warm from their previous engagement. He traced the opening's edge with his fingertips, confirming location and alignment. Then he guided the shell nose backward into the chamber, using his left arm to ram it home. The motion felt completely wrong, backwards, dangerous, contrary to every instruction he'd received. But it worked. The breech mechanism caught the shell's brass case rim and slammed the block shut automatically. The ready indicator illuminated. Henderson fired immediately. The recoil blasted Walter's back. Expanding propellant gases, superheated to approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, rolled backward through the turret. The heat seared through Walter's uniform jacket. He smelled burned wool and cotton and skin. But the shell was loaded. 3.5 seconds from ready rack to breech closure. Walter grabbed the next round. Same motion. Back turned. Left hand guiding. Left arm ramming with his body weight and shoulder behind the thrust instead of extended arm strength alone. 3 seconds. The gun fired again. The Panzers were returning fire now. Walter could hear the distinctive crack of high-velocity tank rounds passing nearby. the sonic boom created when a projectile exceeds the speed of sound. He didn't stop loading. Fourth shell. Fifth shell. His left arm was burning from exertion. Muscles designed for fine motor control and tool manipulation, now being used for repeated heavy lifting with full body weight behind each motion. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. They fired 9 rounds total. 2 Panzers confirmed destroyed. The third retreated behind a tree. When the shooting stopped, Walter's back was covered in powder burns. His uniform jacket had scorch marks across the shoulders. His left arm trembled from exhaustion. His right arm still hung mostly useless. Sergeant Miller climbed down from his position and stared at Walter. Henderson was staring too. Nobody spoke for approximately 15 seconds. Then Miller asked, "How fast was that?" Walter didn't know. He hadn't been timing himself. He'd been trying not to die. Henderson had been counting. Gunners developed this habit naturally, tracking rate of fire to estimate remaining ammunition. He said Walter was loading in 3 seconds. Sometimes less. That was faster than their previous loader, Sergeant Morrison, who had been considered excellent. Faster than anyone else in their platoon. Possibly faster than anyone in the battalion. Miller told Walter to keep doing exactly what he'd just done, however wrong it looked, however much it violated regulations. It worked, but the backwards loading method violated Technical Manual 9-731A in multiple specific ways, and teaching to other loaders could result in courts-martial for everyone involved. The backwards loading method worked because of 3 mechanical principles that Army manual writers had never fully analyzed: leverage, spatial economy, and natural kinesthetic motion. Leverage. When a loader faced a breech using standard procedure, he extended both arms forward to ram a 38-pound shell into the chamber. This motion required pushing against substantial weight with arms at or near full extension. Basic mechanical engineering demonstrates that pushing heavy objects with straight arms provides minimal leverage. The effective force applied equals the muscle strength multiplied by the lever arm distance from the pivot point, in this case, the shoulder joint. With arms extended forward, the lever arm is long, but the mechanical advantage is poor. The loader relies primarily on triceps muscle strength and anterior deltoid strength, muscle groups designed for lighter loads and finer control. When Walter turned his back to the breech, he changed the physics completely. Instead of pushing the shell forward with extended arms, he drove it backward with his arm bent at approximately 90 degrees and his body weight behind the motion. The physics resembled a reverse punch or a rowing motion. Short lever arm, maximum mechanical advantage, utilizing posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, and trapezius muscle groups designed for heavy pulling motions. His arm only traveled approximately 12 inches instead of 24 inches. He could generate more force through a shorter distance. The result? Faster loading with less muscular effort per round. Spatial economy. A Sherman turret was designed for minimum profile. Smaller turrets presented smaller targets. But this created severe spatial constraints for the crew. When a loader faced a breech using standard procedure, his body occupied approximately 24 inches of lateral space. His shoulders were perpendicular to the gun. His elbows extended outward during the ramming motion. In that position, the loader constantly interfered with. The gunner's left arm, operating the traverse, wheeled the commander's position. When he leaned down to observe through the periscope the turret traverse mechanism, itself radio equipment mounted on the turret wall. Every collision cost time, and sometimes caused fumbled shells. When Walter turned his back, his body profile narrowed dramatically. His shoulders aligned parallel to the gun instead of perpendicular. He occupied approximately 10 inches of lateral space instead of 24. This created substantially more room for the gunner to work. Henderson could operate the traverse and elevation wheels without being struck by Walter's elbows. Miller could lean down to use the periscope without hitting Walter's head. The entire crew had more freedom of movement within the same confined space. Natural kinesthetic motion. This was the most important advantage and the hardest to quantify. Right-handed loaders were taught to lead with their right hand because it was their dominant hand. This made logical sense from a training perspective. Use your strongest hand to control the heavy projectile end of the shell. But in the cramped turret, leading with the right hand while standing on the right side of the gun required twisting the torso leftward while reaching rightward. The motion was biomechanically awkward. It required conscious coordination of multiple muscle groups working against each other. Under normal conditions, trained loaders could execute this motion adequately. Under combat stress, with adrenaline flooding the system, hands shaking, heart rate exceeding 150 beats per minute, auditory exclusion from gun blast, tunnel vision from stress response, that conscious coordination often broke down. Loaders fumbled, dropped shells, wasted precious seconds recovering. Left-handed loaders had it worse. They were forced to lead with their weaker hand, while their dominant hand could only support from behind. Every motion fought against their natural neuromuscular patterns. Walter's backwards method eliminated this problem entirely. He reached behind himself with his dominant left hand. The motion was natural, similar to reaching behind to scratch your back, fasten a belt, or retrieve something from a rear pocket. It didn't require conscious thought about which hand to lead with or how to coordinate the motion. Under fire, when his conscious mind was overwhelmed with fear and noise and chaos, muscle memory took over. His left hand knew where the breech was without looking, could feel the opening, guide the shell home. The motion was faster, more reliable, and it worked equally well for both left-handed and right-handed loaders. A right-handed loader could use the same backwards motion, simply leading with his right hand instead. The method had one significant problem. It violated every safety regulation written for Sherman tank gunnery operations. The official Army regulations for tank gunnery, Technical Manual 9-731A, Operation and Maintenance. 75mm gun, tank, M3, mounted in medium tanks M4 and M4A1, were explicit about loading procedures. Section 3, paragraph 47 stated, the loader will face the breech at all times during loading operations. Visual contact with the shell and breech mechanism must be maintained throughout the loading sequence. The loader will employ both hands in coordinated motion, right hand forward to control projectile, left hand supporting the cartridge case. The loader will ram the round forward until the breech mechanism engages the case rim. Upon confirming breech closure, the loader will immediately step clear of the recoil path. Turning your back to a 75mm cannon violated all four requirements simultaneously. The loader did not face the breech. Visual contact was impossible. Both hands were not used in the prescribed coordination. 4. The loader remained in the recoil path during breech closure. The regulations existed for documented reasons. The manual cited 3 specific incidents from North Africa, 1942 to 1943, where improper loading techniques had caused breech failures. Incident 1, El Getter, March 1943. A loader improperly aligned a 75mm round, attempting to force it into the breech at an angle. The shell jammed. When the gunner attempted to clear the jam manually, the breech block closed on his hand, severing 3 fingers. Incident 2, Kasserine Pass, February 1943. A loader rammed the shell tube forcefully, driving it past the proper seating position. When the gun fired, excessive chamber pressure caused the breech block to partially fail, sending hot propellant gases and metal fragments into the turret. 3 crew members suffered severe burns. 1 died from wound infection 12 days later. Incident 3, Fondau Pass, April 1943. A loader failed to confirm proper breech closure before the gunner fired. The breech block was not fully locked. When the gun fired, the block blew open. The loader was killed instantly by the blast. The gunner lost vision in his left eye from metal fragments. These were real incidents with documented casualties. The regulations existed to prevent recurrence. Sergeant Miller knew these regulations. He had been trained on them at Fort Knox in 1942. He had probably helped train younger loaders on proper procedure. He also knew that Walter's backwards method worked. After the September 18th engagement, Miller faced a choice that had no good answer. Option 1, report the violation. Walter would be removed from loading duties. Miller would receive a replacement loader, possibly untrained, possibly left-handed with the same problems, possibly someone who would get them all killed. Option 2, keep quiet. Continue using a technique that violated explicit safety regulations but demonstrably improved their combat effectiveness and survival probability. Miller chose survival. He kept quiet. On September 19, 1944, at approximately 11:23 hours, the engagement described in this story's opening occurred. 3 Panzer IV H tanks, each mounting a 75mm KWK 40L/48 gun capable of penetrating 89mm of armor at 500 meters, advanced toward positions held by elements of the 37th Tank Battalion near Arracourt. Sergeant Miller's Sherman engaged from approximately 800 yards. Walter loaded using his backwards method. The engagement statistics. Total duration, 6 minutes, 14 seconds rounds fired. 12, 8 armor piercing for high explosive. Panzers destroyed. For the 4th Panzer appeared during the engagement. Average loading time, 2.4 seconds per round. 0 American casualties. Other tank commanders in the battalion noticed when your unit is losing tanks at a 3-to-1 ratio. You pay attention to any crew that significantly beats those odds. By September 20th, 3 other loaders in 37 Tank Battalion were experimenting with the backwards technique. By September 21st, 8 loaders were using it regularly in combat. None asked permission. They just started turning their backs to the breech during engagements, and they started surviving. The results were measurable. Standard loading, 4 to 5 seconds per round. Average engagement, 6 to 7 rounds fired. Average engagement duration, 24-35 seconds of actual fire and survival rate, approximately 60% in tank versus tank engagements. Backwards loading, 2.5 to 3 seconds per round. Average engagement, 9 to 10 rounds fired. Average engagement duration, 22 to 30 seconds of actual fire and survival rate, approximately 78% in tank versus tank engagements. The method was spreading through whispered conversations and quick demonstrations behind maintenance sheds. No written instructions. No official training. No approval from higher command. Just loaders teaching each other a technique that could get them courts-martialed if anyone with authority noticed and decided to enforce regulations. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams noticed. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37 Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. He was 30 years old in September 1944. Abrams had graduated from West Point in 1936, ranked 185th out of 276 cadets. Not a stellar academic record, but had excelled in the practical application of armored tactics. After graduation, he was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Regiment, then transferred to Armored Forces when the Army began expanding its mechanized units. By September 1944, Abrams had already established a reputation for aggressive armored tactics. He would later lead the armored column that broke through German lines to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. He would eventually become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, 1972 to 1974, and would have the M1 Abrams tank named after him posthumously. But in September 1944, he was a battalion commander trying to keep his crews alive while accomplishing missions against numerically superior German armor. On September 23rd, 1944, Abrams was observing a training exercise when he saw one of his loaders turn his back to the breech. The motion was distinctive, completely contrary to every training procedure Abrams had ever observed. The loader completed the sequence in under 3 seconds. Abrams called the exercise to a halt, ordered the crew out of the tank, demanded an explanation. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, explained about Walter, about the backwards method, about the combat results, about the survival rates. Abrams listened without interruption. When Miller finished, Abrams asked one question. Does it work better than a manual? Miller's response. Yes, sir. 2 seconds faster per round on average. Higher accuracy under fire because the gunner has more room to work. Fewer fumbled shells because the dominant hand is doing the work. Better crew coordination in tight spaces. Abrams was silent for approximately 30 seconds. Every tanker in the exercise area was watching, waiting to see if Miller and Walter would face charges for violating regulations. Then Abrams made a decision that would change American armored tactics for the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams ordered every loader in the 37 Tank Battalion to learn the backwards method immediately. He didn't care what Technical Manual 9-731A stated. He cared about 2 metrics, kill ratios and crew survival rates. If turning your back to a 75mm cannon kept his men alive and allowed them to destroy more enemy tanks, then that became the new battalion standard. Regulations could be revised later. His men were dying now. Within 48 hours, the 37 Tank Battalion was training every replacement loader on Walter's technique. Abrams brought Walter in personally to demonstrate the motion, made him show it step by step, had experienced loaders practice until they could match Walter's 3-second loading time. The training was entirely informal. No written documentation. No official modification. The field procedures. No paperwork sent to higher headquarters for approval. Just practical instruction that demonstrably worked. By October 1st, 1944, approximately 90% of loaders in the 37 Tank Battalion were using the backwards method in combat. They were losing fewer tanks, destroying more Panzers, coming home alive. Other battalion commanders in 4th Armored Division noticed, started asking Abrams what he was doing differently. He told them, showed them, had Walter demonstrate for visiting commanders. Some adopted the technique immediately. Others resisted. The manual was a manual, Regulations existed for reasons. Changing field procedures without authorization from Ordnance Department or Armored Force School was improper. But General George Smith Patton Jr. commanded 3rd Army. And Patton cared about exactly 2 things: speed of advance and casualty ratios. On October 7, 1944, General Patton visited 4th Armored Division headquarters at Châtel-sur-Moselle. The visit was partly ceremonial. 4th Armored had been instrumental in 3rd Army's rapid advance across France, and partly practical. Patton wanted to understand why 4th Armored's kill ratios had improved so dramatically in recent weeks. His staff had shown him the after-action reports. 4th Armored was destroying German tanks at rates that significantly exceeded other divisions. Something had changed. Patton turned to his chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, and gave a direct order. Every tank battalion in 3rd Army will adopt this loading method immediately. Any battalion commander who refuses will be relieved. Any officer who courts-martials a loader for using this technique will answer to me personally. Within 2 weeks, the backwards loading method was standard practice across 3rd Army. Training officers demonstrated it to replacement crews at the reinforcement depot. Veteran loaders taught it to new arrivals during their first week with operational units. The technique spread from battalion to battalion through official channels now, not whispered conversations, not secret demonstrations. Official adoption with command authorization. The backwards loading method wasn't the only factor. Improved training, better tactics, declining German fuel and ammunition stocks all contributed. But statistical analysis suggested the loading technique accounted for approximately 30 to 40% of the improvement in both kill ratios and survival rates. 1st Army and 9th Army noticed. By January 1945, loaders across the entire European theater were turning their backs to the breech. The technique reached the Pacific theater by March 1945. Tank crews fighting on Okinawa used the same method Walter had discovered by accident in France. The Army never officially revised Technical Manual 9-731A. As of May 8, 1945, V-Day, the regulations still stated that loaders should face the breech at all times. But every experienced tank commander knew better. The manual represented theory and peacetime safety considerations. The backwards method represented combat reality and survival. By war's end in August 1945, tens of thousands of Sherman loaders had used Walter's technique. Conservative estimates by military historians suggest the method may have contributed to saving 300 to 500 American tank crew lives based on improved survival rates in units that adopted it. Walter Kowalski received no medal for inventing the backwards loading method, no commendation, no official recognition. The Army doesn't award decorations for violating regulations, even when those violations save lives. He did receive a promotion. On October 15, 1944, Sergeant Miller recommended Walter for promotion to corporal. The recommendation cited exceptional performance under fire and innovative solutions to tactical problems. The promotion was approved. His tank was hit 3 times, twice by Panzer IV rounds that failed to penetrate, once by a Panther round that destroyed their transmission but didn't penetrate the fighting compartment. Walter walked away each time. His crew destroyed 23 German tanks between September 1944 and May 1945. Walter loaded every round, used the backwards method for every shot. By May 1945, he could load a 75mm shell in 2.1 seconds consistently. His hands knew the motion so completely that conscious thought wasn't required anymore. He could load in darkness, in smoke, while the tank was moving over rough ground, while taking fire. Muscle memory. Pure trained reflex. Walter returned to Detroit in July 1945, received his discharge at Fort Sheridan, Illinois on August 12, 1945, with the rank of corporal and an honorable service record. He returned to his job as a mechanic at Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant. The plant had produced Sherman tanks during the war. Ford built 1,690 M4A3 Shermans between 1942 and 1945. Some of the tanks Walter had loaded shells into were probably built in the facility where he now repaired civilian automobiles. He married Dorothy and Sullivan in June 1947. They had 3 children, Michael, born 1948, Patricia, born 1950, and Robert, born 1953. Walter worked at Ford for 41 years, retiring in 1986 at age 65 with full pension. He never spoke much about the war. Most veterans of his generation didn't. When asked by his children what he did during the war, Walter's standard response was, "I loaded shells into a tank gun. Wasn't anything special. But the technique he invented, born from injury and desperation, and the simple fact that he was left-handed, continued to save lives long after he came home. During the Korean War, the United States deployed M4 A3 E8 Sherman tanks, the EZ-8 variant with improved suspension and 76mm gun, and M26 Pershing medium tanks against North Korean T-34/85 tanks and later Chinese Type 58 tanks. Marine Corps tank crews operating Shermans around the Pusan perimeter in August-September 1950 were trained on the backwards loading method at Camp Pendleton before deployment. Combat reports from the 1st Marine Division noted that loader speed was critical in close-range tank engagements where first-shot advantage often determined survival. Backwards loading technique gave Marine crews measurable advantages. Standard loading, 76mm round, 41 pounds, 4.5 to 5 seconds backwards loading, 3.2 to 3.5 seconds. The 1.5 second difference per round meant Marine Shermans could typically fire 8 to 9 rounds in the time North Korean T-34 crews fired 6 to 7 rounds. In engagements where both tanks spotted each other simultaneously, the American crew usually got the killing shot first. The last combat deployment of M4 Sherman tanks was by the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, which operated M4 A3E8 variants until 1975. But the loading principles Walter discovered remained relevant for American M48 Patton tanks, 90mm gun, and M60 Patton tanks, 105mm gun, used extensively by U.S. Army and Marine Corps units in Vietnam. Loaders operating M48s adapted the backwards method for the larger 90mm rounds, 43 pounds. The motion worked the same way. Turn your back, feel for the breech, ram the shell home using body weight and shoulder strength. Training films produced at Fort Knox in 1968 to 1971 showed modified backwards loading techniques for the M48. The films never mentioned Walter Kowalski or the method's origins. They simply presented it as efficient loading procedure for confined turret spaces. Even after introduction of the M1 Abrams tank in 1980, with its sophisticated semi-automatic loading system for 120mm rounds, variations of Walter's technique remained relevant. The M1's human loader. The tank still requires one crew member to handle ammunition manually before it enters the automatic loading mechanism, uses a modified backwards grip when extracting rounds from the ready rack and positioning them for the automated system. The physics remain the same. In a confined space, turning your back and using your dominant hand behind you provides better leverage and spatial economy than facing forward with extended arms. Training at Fort Benning continued teaching modified backwards loading procedures until the mid-1990s, when automation became sophisticated enough that manual loading technique mattered less. Instructors who had served in Vietnam, who learned the technique from Korean War veterans, who learned it from World War II veterans, passed the method down to a new generation without necessarily knowing its origins. In 1993, Dr. James Morrison, no relation to the Sergeant Morrison who died at Arracourt, a military historian researching 4th Armored Division tactics, found references to backwards loading method in after-action reports from September-October 1944. The references were brief. Commanders mentioned improved loading times, but didn't explain the technique in detail. Morrison became curious about what seemed to be an undocumented tactical innovation. He tracked Walter down through veteran registries. Walter was 72 years old, still living in Detroit, retired from Ford. Morrison interviewed Walter for approximately 3 hours. Walter confirmed the story, demonstrated the motion, using a broomstick to simulate a 75mm shell, explained the physics as he understood them. It wasn't anything special, Walter told Morrison. My shoulder was hurt. I couldn't load the regular way. I just did what worked. Morrison published his findings in the Journal of Military History, spring 1994 edition, in an article titled Tactical Innovation at the Squad Level. The case of the backwards loading method, 37th Tank Battalion, 1944. The article estimated that the technique contributed to saving 300 to 500 American tank crew lives based on statistical analysis of survival rates in units that adopted the method compared to units that didn't. That estimate was conservative and covered only the European theater between October 1944 and May 1945. It didn't account for Korea, Vietnam, or subsequent decades of training. Walter Kowalski died on February 18, 2004, at age 82 from complications of pneumonia. He was buried at Resurrection Cemetery in Clinton Township, Michigan. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press was brief. Walter J. Kowalski, 82, of Clinton Township, died February 18th. U.S. Army veteran, World War II, European theater. Retired Ford Motor Company employee. Survived by wife Dorothy, children Michael, Patricia, and Robert, 7 grandchildren. Services at Sacred Heart Catholic Church. The obituary did not mention that he had changed how American tanks fought, did not mention the backwards loading method, did not mention that his innovation, born from injury and desperation, had influenced armored tactics for 3 wars spanning 50 years. At his funeral, 7 men attended who were not family members. All were veterans. All were former tank loaders. They had learned the backwards technique from men who learned it from men who served with Walter in France. None of them had ever met Walter before that day. They came because they understood what he had given them. They understood that sometimes the most important innovations come from scared 23-year-olds trying not to die, from mechanics who figure out better ways to survive, from soldiers who break the rules when the rules don't work. Today, Walter's service record is available at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, Record Group 407, Entry 427, Box 18374. The documents list his rank, unit assignments, dates of service. Nothing more. But if you request the after-action reports from 4th Armored Division for September-October 1944, you'll find brief references to improved loading procedures and enhanced crew efficiency. The reports don't explain why. They just note the results. At the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky, now part of the National Armor and Cavalry Museum, a restored M4 Sherman sits on permanent display. The interior is preserved exactly as it appeared in 1944. The loader's position on the right side of the turret is cramped, tight. When you stand where Walter stood, you understand immediately why he turned his back. There simply wasn't room to do it any other way, not if you wanted to survive. The museum placard describes the Sherman specifications: armor thickness, gun caliber, engine horsepower, production numbers. It mentions that American tank crews developed innovative tactics to overcome the Sherman's disadvantages against heavier German armor. It does not mention Walter Kowalski, does not mention the backwards loading method, does not mention that sometimes the most important innovations come from ordinary people making split-second decisions under fire. That's how wars are won. Not by generals or grand strategy or superior equipment alone. By mechanics who figure out better ways to load shells. By soldiers who break the rules when the rules don't work. By left-handed kids from Detroit who couldn't use their right arm and had to find another way. Walter Kowalski never claimed to be a hero. He was just a loader who discovered that turning his back worked better than facing forward. It saved his life, and it saved hundreds of others.